So let's go ahead and get started. Thank you again to everyone who's joined us. Really appreciate you coming out and, well, staying home and joining us on this wonderful summer afternoon. We've got a really interesting program for you today. This is our Far Hills Speaker Series, which is a collaboration between the Wright Library and the Oakwood Historical Society, and it's a wonderful collaboration that the library's just thrilled to be part of, and so glad that we've been able to work together to bring such wonderful events such as this to the community. If you have any technical difficulties, please message me in the chat and I can try to help you with that. If you're having issues with audio, you can dial in. The number is in the chat and should be part of the registration and reminder emails that you got from Zoom. Also, we are streaming this live on YouTube, so if you're having any trouble with the Zoom webinar, you can switch over to the link. Again, that is in the chat, and watch it there. So the Far Hills, I think this is actually the first time we've had an August event for the Far Hills Speaker Series, at least in the several years that I've been doing this. But it was an opportunity we couldn't pass up. And it's all about dresses and the history of American Dressmaker. Our speaker today is Amelia Reichelderfer, and she is a dressmaker and milliner. And although her career has been in banking, she's always pursued her interest in public history. And in 2019, she received her master's degree in public history from Wright State University. And it is from her thesis that this presentation comes. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Angela and let her take over. Thank you, Angela.
Well, good afternoon, and welcome to this edition of the Far Hills Speaker Series, The American Dressmaker, Women's Emancipation and the Collapse of an Industry. I'd like to extend a special thank you to the Wright Memorial Library and the Oakwood Historical Society for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Again, my name is Amelia Reichelderfer. I am a historic clothing specialist and a master dressmaker specializing in historic costume. And my particular expertise is in progressive era women's fashion, which is around 1880 to 1920. And for this presentation, I'm going to discuss how women's journey towards social liberation or emancipation during America's progressive age upended the dressmaking profession, a trade which gave the women who worked in that industry social influence, professional respect, and of course economic independence. But before I start, I'd like to offer up a little personal disclosure. Because of the nature of the unusual nature of my profession as a historic costumer, I'm often asked if I watch historical dramas and programs specifically for the costumes, and indeed I am this person, often to the aggravation of my friends who want to discuss thematic events and particular character arcs, and the only thing I can remember, of course, are the costumes. So to begin, the fashion timeline that's being referenced here regarding the American dressmaking industry and the collapse of the dressmaking trade is about a 50-year period between the mid-1870s, which is about mid-Reconstruction, to the mid-1920s or the early Jazz Age, or the interwar era, as many historians refer to. And it is within this time period that the dressmaking trade is at its height in the United States. And this is not just relative to the sheer numbers of women who are actually employed in the trade, but the trade is also at its height in professional recognition and income. So who was the American dressmaker? Who was she? She was a business owner or a paid employee in a dress shop or fashion house. She was a trained specialist, so she was a master clothier of feminine apparel. And feminine apparel at this time in history is defined exclusively as women's clothing. So it's actually the clothing that women are wearing, not the aesthetic value of the clothing. She was apprenticed and journeyed for 5 to 12 years. Dressmaker training was generally 5 to 7 years, but many women cross-trained as milliners, which are hat makers, or tailors. And so their training was more extensive and therefore it took longer. She was a fashion designer, and she was involved in every step of the creative and construction process of each garment that she designed. And she wasn't a seamstress, which was a low-skilled factory laborer who sewed blocks of fabric together. Now, apprentices in the dressmaking trade did begin their training as seamstresses, and they spent the first year of their training mastering stitching techniques and doing the grunt work that the master dressmakers and the journeywomen did not want to do or simply didn't have time to do. So after the apprentices mastered seamstressing, they would move up into trimming and finishing and creating patterns, and then of course making their own dresses in a journeymanship. She wasn't a tailor, which was a master clothier of masculine clothing. And masculine apparel at that time in fashion history was clothing that included trousers, like men's suits, but it also included women's riding habits and equestrian ensembles. So even though these riding outfits for women had skirts, they wore trousers underneath them for modesty, but more so, of course, to protect them while they were riding the horse. So to give an example, a beautiful pictorial example of the dressmaker's skill and artistic level, we need not look any further than our own state and the exquisite work of the dressmakers in the Cincinnati region during America's progressive age. The dressmakers highlighted here are Adeline Martian and Kate Craigmile, and these are just two of the dressmakers who expertly and superbly dressed the ladies of Cincinnati high society. And if you have not had the opportunity to look through Cynthia Amnius's book, A Separate Sphere, Dressmakers in Cincinnati's Golden Age, I actually encourage you to. The photographic examples that she includes of the clothing created by the dressmakers in this book are more than eye candy. They're actually, I consider them visual dope. I mean, they are just incredible. So in the late 1870s, the United States begins to emerge as an economic superpower. And this is spurred by mass immigration and the transformation of the American workforce. And so immigrants, they not only provide their labor, but they also bring with them their ideas, their ambitions, their work ethics, their skills as trade professionals. And so we begin to see the United States advance quickly in areas of technology, particularly in industrial mechanization. And this drives the rise in employment opportunities. And by the 1890s, we actually exceed England and Europe combined in manufacturing and wealth. And so women's clothing becomes like this discernible indicator of the nation's economic prosperity, and it projects the affluent class's social attitude regarding American superiority as the world's new industrial superpower. So consumer demand for fine clothing created this boom in the dressmaking trade. So the number of women employed as dressmakers in the United States triples from about 189,000 in 1870 to 580,000 by 1910. So that's more than 500,000 women working in the trade. Now, it's also important to note, however, that the Gilded Age was also an era of unprecedented poverty, and there were few employment opportunities which offered a wage earner a supporting income. This was particular for women whose labor and income contributions to the economic viability of the home and the nation were viewed as not her own, but an extension of the male head of house, her husband or father. It was an extension of his labor and income. So for those women who lived outside of the middle class idea of the traditional family, without help from extended family, was most certainly, poverty was most certain, and prostitution was also common to supplement income. In contrast, dressmakers accomplished in the trade were professionally and socially respected. And this was due to the very nature of their occupation as purveyors of the latest fashion trends in service to a very affluent clientele. So their respectability as trade professionals was an extension of the socially respectable women that they serviced. So in turn, the dressmaking trade offered women unique employment opportunities, including financial independence and an alternative to the middle-class standard of domesticity. Now, as the United States begins to emerge as the world's economic superpower and the skills and services of the American dressmaker are coming into high demand, underlying social attitudes regarding women, for example, like their place in society and the idea of women being persons with autonomy rather than mere extensions of their male relations, is beginning to change. And it is at this juncture in America's economic history where women begin to journey toward their own emancipation. And it is this progression of female liberation that sets in motion the collapse of the dressmaking trade, the very industry that gave women who work the trade social influence, of course, professional respect and financial independence. And it begins with allowing women to access higher education post-Civil War. So during Reconstruction, well, right after the Civil War, we have an estimation of 750,000 men who died. And by the way, this is a renewed estimate after extensive research. The original estimate was 640,000, I do believe. So it's been upped a little bit. And the death of so many men during the Civil War left a significant minority of families without a provider or male heir. And furthermore, 10% of males ages 8 to 18 had died. And this created a significant minority of women who would never marry or bear sons. And so there was this shortage of, like I said, young, healthy marriage age males. Furthermore, there is the emancipation of the nation's 4 million slaves, and African Americans accounting for about 17% of the US population, and nearly all of them at this time are illiterate. This brought up the question of legacy, inheritance, the financial support of dependent family members, and the economic development and reconstruction of the nation in the aftermath of this war. And so states and religious institutions began to file for college land grants through the Morrill Act to meet the rising demand for education. So the number of colleges in the United States triples in 1870, between 1870 and 1920, and 35% of those new schools are for women. So as women enter higher education, we see here that some of the colleges that were actually benefits of the Morrill Act of 1862, we have Fisk College and of course the University of Michigan. And then, of course, Spelman College, which is the oldest historic Black college for women in the United States, and it was founded in 1891. And then there's Evelyn College, which is an extension of Princeton University because women were not allowed on their campus. So Princeton was generous enough to open up a women's division down the street. And it is also the first women's college in New Jersey, and it was founded in 1887. Here in Ohio, Ohio State University was a recipient of the Morrill Act, and it was also founded in 1870. And Wilberforce University, which is a historic Black college here in the Xenia, Miami Valley area, even though it was not founded on the Morrill Act land grant, it did receive a land grant in 1890 to expand its commercial and industrial department, which has now become Central State University. So as more women enroll in institutions of higher education post-World War, or post-Civil War, I'm sorry, their exposure to physical education and their growing enthusiasm toward health, exercise, and sport requires a new type of clothing. Clothing that is less restrictive, that is comfortable, it's constructed from durable and washable fabrics, and it can be bought and worn as separates. interesting, if you notice the transition in style of women's gym clothes over a 20-year period. So we have Vassar College here, and of course, you can see these ladies are dressed in full-scale dresses. And although these women are wearing their own, they're actually wearing their own dresses. They're not in uniform. But notice that it is a full-length skirt, a bodice, and of course they would have a petticoat, corset, drawers, and chemise underneath that as well. Versus the ladies over on the right from the University of Utah who are wearing shirts and knickers about two decades later. So there is this huge transition in clothing in women's colleges, in gymnasium clothing. So by the 1890s, shirts and knickers become the standard sports and gym uniform for women across most educational institutions in the United States, including primary and secondary school, who are starting to incorporate physical education in their curriculums. The comfort and ease of gym uniforms began to quickly transition from the American gymnasium to American streetwear and high fashion. And of course, we have the birth of American sportswear. So sportswear is the first true American fashion, and it sharply departs from the dictates of Parisian high fashion. And it comes to symbolize the new woman, the Gibson girl, the modern female, the modern female, it's modern female independence and all her pursuits in education, sports, and leisure, and of course her work outside of the home. So this new fashion is no fuss, it is practical, it's versatile, and it's for everyday wear and activity, and it quickly becomes the style worn by all women, regardless of social class. More importantly, because of sportswear's simplified construction, it could be easily copied and mass produced. And through mass production, it becomes affordable, even for women of working class who generally cannot afford the services of a dressmaker. And to appreciate the significance of sportswear in women's fashion, we only have to look at the fashions leading up to the introduction and enthusiastic reception of this new and liberating American mode of dress. The progression of Gilded Age fashion becomes increasingly restrictive, and it's fashionably ridiculous to the point where it becomes a regular target of satire. So this mode of fashion, which is coming out of Paris, no longer complements the increasing active lifestyle of the American woman as she's coming into her own and becoming more publicly visible and, of course, socially involved. Interestingly, candid photographs taken of women's street style in the late 1890s, when sportswear first disrupted the fashion industry, shows that it has become the preferred style for women. And because of consumer demand and the increase in which sportswear can be mass produced, the factory garment industry greatly expands. So in 1900, where there are about 53,000 wage earners in the factory garment industry, by 1910, just a decade later, that number, the number of those employed in that industry explodes to 242,000. However, despite the increase in factory-made clothing and the growing popularity of the department store, the new consumer market, where mass-produced goods are now sold, the dressmaking trade is still in full swing, and we have about 600,000 women who are still employed in the industry in 1910. Now, how long the dressmaking trade would have flourished or even survived alongside the factory garment industry can only be left to speculation. As history would have it, at the height of the dressmaking trade, the world went to war in 1914. So as women entered the armed services and filled professional vacancies on the home front left by enlisted men, they quickly adopted practical work clothing, including overalls and trousers. for their own health and safety. Furthermore, wartime rationing of fabrics at this time and supplies placed the high fashion industry, which by the way is the dressmakers market, on hold. And it forced the garment industry overall to cut women's clothing in plainer styles using less fabric to accommodate the production of service uniforms. And so women's dresses essentially become these simple ankle length tunics, which can be slipped over the head and body with ease. This certainly advanced the interest of clothing manufacturers who could mass produce these garments quickly and cheaply for consumer market, but not for dressmakers who found themselves in competition for supplies with the factory garment industry, and here they just simply couldn't compete, not only with supplies, but also with output and also in cost. Finally, by 1920, the dressmaking trade, which in the decades prior to World War I had given women employed in the industry a real opportunity at financial independence and social respect as working professionals, where little opportunity existed outside of marriage and the home. They had lost the battle against the united forces of large-scale manufacturing and the commercial power of the department stores. And so the collapse of the dressmaking trade in the United States had its beginning, or had its origin, in women's journey toward their own emancipation and their move toward opportunities outside of the home post-Civil War. And as women became more socially visible and active and entered the workforce, their need and desire for simple, practical, and comfortable garments launched the large-scale mass production of clothing and expanded the retail and commercial opportunities for America's department stores. And in consequence, it consigned the American dressmaker to history.
Thank you, Angela. That was wonderful. And we have plenty of time for questions. So we have several different ways for you to ask Angela questions. You can do that by typing it into the chat or into the Q&A, which both of those can be accessed at the bottom of the screen in Zoom. Or if you feel that you can give your question better by speaking, we can allow you to speak. Just have to raise your hand to let us know. Does anybody have any questions? So we have a question. Angela, do you have any social media links that we can go and follow?
Social, regarding costumes, women's history.
Let's see if we have more information here. You personally, do you have do you have a Facebook page or?
Oh, I do actually. Shamelessly, I have not, I should be keeping up with it. I do have a blog. It is called The Merry Dressmaker. It is on Blogger. You can follow me there. Also, I am on Instagram as The Merry Dressmaker, and you can see my costuming work. I post a lot of construction pictures, so you can get on board on how certain things are put together. I also have a Flickr page. I haven't updated it yet lately. I don't even know if people use Flickr anymore, but it is I do have a photo album there, and in those particular photo albums, there are construction pictures of particular gowns I've worked on. And of course, I do need to update those. So I apologize if you visit them and there's not quite there what you expected. So anyone else?
So we have a question from Tracy. What type and year of sewing machine do you make your dresses with?
Oh, when I first started, I had a neighbor who gave me it was the first electric model made by Wright. the White company, and I still have it. It is a 1913 sewing machine. And that's what I first started out on. And I still love the way it stitches. The stitches are they're perfect. It's precision. The only reason I don't use it anymore is because when I put my knee up against the lever to engage the engine or the motor so I can sew, it gives me a little shock. And so I've decided I probably didn't want to use that anymore. But the machines that I use are Vikings. They are, and I use basic Vikings. So I don't have like electronic screen panels. That's all fluff that I don't need. And besides, once those screen panels go blank, you're not sewing anymore on those machines. So Viking is my preferred. I like Juki too.
Okay. Kathleen says that she read there was a movement to sport corsets at that time.
I'm sorry, could you repeat?
Sure. She says that there was actually, I'm going to let Kathleen ask the question. So
Okay.
Kathleen, I'm going to allow you to speak. And if you can just unmute yourself and speak.
Thank you so much. I study a lot of periods in history. My current interest is actually this exact time period and the kind of window in the feminist and progressive movements at this time. And I recently read a book about Josephina Breckenridge that talked about certain kinds of clothing that were adopted by early feminists and progressives, especially women, in order to kind of liberate the female form. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, and what's interesting is there's a lot of literature, medical literature during this time about female health and liberating the female form. And we even start to see this in the undergarments that are being manufactured probably starting around the late 1880s up until, of course, the turn of the 20th century. And women's undergarments are becoming far more flexible. And that's necessary because women are working and they're engaging in sport. And the tight-waisted corsets and the padded hips and the padded busts of the Victorian age, like I said, they no longer complement the modern woman. And so, yes, there is a direct correlation between women's emancipation and also clothing emancipation. They moved right along. And by the time we get to, I would say, not necessarily World War I, but probably somewhere between, I don't know, 1905, maybe 1910, the elastic girdle becomes popular and the corset is on its way out. And so we see the waistline, women's waistlines, they aren't as emphasized anymore. And that's particular in 1920s fashion. Where the waistline has absolutely no emphasis at all. So hopefully I answered your question.
You did, although I will be looking at your media pages to dig for more information, as you know, it's just something I'm looking into right now.
All right, I appreciate that. Thank you so much for your question.
Okay, and Anne has a question. Did the types of fabrics used change significantly during this time?
They did, but for working class women, no. Working class women always used the wool, cotton, linen. Upper class women, on the other hand, of course, their gowns, which we have the most examples of as extant garments in museums and repositories, of course, are made of exquisite fabrics like silks and furs and things like that. But as women increasingly became visible, it was unreasonable to wear these expensive fabrics that you couldn't wash or care for. And that's why sportswear was so popular, because you could care for it. You could send it to the launderer, and most likely it would be a she, and she'd get it all gussied up for you and send it right back. Where if you dumped anything on a silk gown, it was ruined. And so that's the appeal. And women needed care easy clothes. And interestingly enough, we wear these care easy clothes today. We would have it no other way. How many of us really want to pick up an iron? We don't. That's why we have wrinkle-free clothing now. And so the American sports trend, we're still living with it. And so yes, to answer your question, fabrics did change significantly. more exquisite fabrics like silks were actually reserved for evening wear or special occasion, rather than your walking dress of the 1880s. Dresses or clothing, women's clothing, started to take on fabrics that were far friendlier in care.
Great. So Donna has a question. What was the extent of the dressmaking industry in Dayton, and did department stores, area department stores, retain dressmakers in their designer departments?
Dayton, like most major cities, had major department stores. There was Wright's. Later, I do believe in the 1920s and 30s, there was Donnenfeld's, and then, of course, in Columbus, there was Lazarus. And so, yes, these department stores started to employ dressmakers. And keep in mind, too, these dressmakers weren't very well paid, and they were also under male management. And so they weren't, they didn't work independently on their own. And oftentimes the dressmakers that were employed in department stores actually altered more often the ready-made clothing that was actually being sold there, or they added embellishments. They really weren't making unique dresses or bespoke garments. They were just gussying up the clothing that was already there for sale off the rack. But eventually, as ready-made clothing, became more popular, clothing stores didn't even offer the services of a dressmaker. And so, I hope I answered that question.
So Missy is asking, what surprised you the most about your topic while doing your research?
The thing that surprised me most is that women were actually responsible for the collapse of a woman's industry. So the traditional view of the dressmaking industry is that it collapsed due to the invention of the sewing machine, the invention of paper patterns, the invention the mass production of clothing, and that's not necessarily true. The dressmaker not only survived these things initially, she actually incorporated them into her business. So dressmakers, in fact, did use sewing machines. Dressmakers did use patterns, and it was actually economically wise to use patterns because you could quickly make a garment. You wouldn't have to create something, new. It kind of expedited the process, and it was particular to undergarments. So dressmakers incorporated all of these inventions into their own shops, but it was women themselves and this drive forward to emancipation and this need for clothing that was simple and easy and they could move in it. The problem with that was that it upturned the dressmaker's market, and her market were these beautiful fitted, garments that didn't make sense to wear anymore. And as a result of these, like I said, easy care, loose fitting garments, it opened the door for the mass production of clothing. And so her skills were no longer needed and no longer appreciated. So yeah. So that was the most surprising part, that women did it to women inadvertently, but it was done.
Deborah's asking or saying she's trying to break into historical costuming, and she's always looking for references, and assuming that'd be kind of ways to get started in it.
Yeah, there are, oh my gosh, there are so many books, and you know something, I have so many of them, and all of a sudden my mind went blank. I'm looking at my library at my house right now and I see no titles. Well, We don't apprentice for dressmaking anymore, so that's out of the question. However, there are wonderful publications that out there that actually, Janet Arnold is one of them. So look her up. She has fantastic books. You can buy her things on Amazon. She has drafting books where she has actually went in and sketched costumes, and she has a series of these costume books that from everything from the Renaissance era on up to the 1920s and 30s. So Janet Arnold is a good place to start on her works. Also, Ruth Turner. Ruth Turner wrote a book called The Mode of Costume, and her book, I believe it came out in the 1940s. And you can buy a reprinted copy of that on Amazon. Most public libraries carry her book. It may actually be down in their archive section. That's where I bought the one, or borrowed the one that I originally found. They actually had to go down into the basement and get it from the archival section because it's an older book. But Ruth Turner, it's Ruth Wilcox Turner. She wrote several books on the history of women's fashion, and she goes into detail, and she has beautiful illustrations. So you probably want to look at her book and her books. And she also did millinery, shoes, outerwear. So she has a whole closet of books that go over women's clothing and accessories. So that's a good start.
And we have a couple of different questions on how you got started in taking on this topic, and for your master's thesis. What kind of led you to do that, choose this topic, and how did you kind of tailor your education towards this as your thesis?
When I originally started my master's program, it was in bioethics. So it was far removed from the dressmaking trade. But I changed it. I changed my thesis into something I knew that I would love, and something that I knew that I was passionate about. And so it all sort of began 20-something years ago. I was in between exams. I was finishing my undergrad, and I was in between exams, and I had 2 hours to go. So I thought I'd walk over to this antique shop over on State Street in Westerville, Ohio. And as I was thumbing through some of the books on the shelf, I came across a ledger, a tiny ledger that was sandwiched between these two gigantic ledgers. And when I pulled it out, it was a student's millinery book over her 3-year instruction from Wilberforce University. And I was amazed by it. It has illustrations, it's beautifully handwritten. And so I bought it. I paid $8 for it. And it sat on my shelf for years. And believe it or not, I really didn't even go through it and look at it. And then one day I was designing a costume for a particular customer of mine, and I needed a reference regarding the hat that was to accompany this costume. And I thought, why not look at a direct historical reference? And so I pulled that ledger and I went through it, and I all of a sudden realized that on the inside cover of this book there was a workroom ticket with the instructor's name on it, and I realized that the student's name was also in this book, and I made a quick note to myself and to remember them. And so I started to research them. And through researching these women, Sarah Barker is the woman who wrote the manual, and Catherine McRoberts is her instructor. So as I went through and started researching these women and looking at their lives, I just kind of fell into this rabbit hole, and I just started following in them. And then I started looking at the American Dressmaker and their experiences, and it just went from there. And it just went on and on and on to this.
All right. So Mary has several questions, so I'm going to just let her talk. So Mary, you are able to talk if you can unmute yourself. Are you there, Mary? Okay.
Here I am.
Oh, good.
Can you
Hello.
hear me?
Yes, we can.
I may not have it working yet. Am I still?
Are you there, Mary?
I was.
Yeah, I can hear you.
One more time. Hello?
Hello.
Okay, maybe not all.
Oh, okay. Sounds like maybe we're having some issues there.
Oh, it's another
Yes.
Mary. Okay. Not working yet. Am I
Are
still?
you there?
Oh, there it is.
I can hear you.
One more time. Hello?
Hello.
Okay.
Okay.
It's a
Sounds like
delay.
maybe we're having,
There must be a delay to it. Oh, it's another Mary. Okay.
oh, Mary, if you have something else going in the background, I think. So let me just go ahead and go through your questions real quick, and we'll cover them. I'm sorry. So her first question was, are you working on anything past 1920?
Yeah, I do. I work on a lot of clothes from the 1940s and 50s. I have made me several cute jumpers from the 1960s. So yeah, I do. I work on vintage clothing as well. And I do love clothing from the 1940s.
Great. So any ideas about how this year's mask making frenzy might be reflective of that century ago activity? I'm assuming referring to the 1918 pandemic?
Well,
Maybe not.
I'm not really sure. I don't know. Most of us know about the pandemic of 1819. I don't know a lot of history regarding how they were able to control it or slow it. So I'm not sure if they were wearing masks. It's not. I'm not really sure. However, I think that there is something interesting to say about current fashion wearing masks and the actual spread of the virus, which I find quite interesting. So South Korea has been wearing face masks for decades, and they do this for health because the pollution in their cities are pretty significant. And mask wearing, of course, was picked up by the youth, their youth culture, and it has become a fashion symbol. It is a huge trend, a big craze over there. And they have these beautiful designer masks. And of course, it gives teenagers this kind of allure and mystique. And so it's this really cool thing. And it's common in their culture to wear it. And as a result, they have one of the lowest transmission rates in the world. They only have less than 16,000 cases. So I thought this is very interesting that a fashion trend, something brought about by necessity regarding pollution and lung health has actually helped their population stave off our current pandemic. So that's kind of a little interesting piece of fashion history, or current history, I should say.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
So another question from Mary was, what was the impact of Amelia Bloomer and the bicycle on modern clothing? I'm assuming that plays in just some of the activity.
Amelia Bloomer. Well, let me just tell you what, bloomers didn't go over really well. We kind of latch onto her, and I'm not really sure why we do. They weren't ready. Society, even women weren't ready for the bloomer. It was just it was a fashion that was just a little too outrageous. There were specific ideas about feminine dress, and the bloomer wasn't part of that. Women wore bikes and skirts, and this is kind of, road bikes and skirts. And this is kind of an interesting little factoid about bicycles. So everybody is familiar with the female bike. and the male bike. And so the female cross stabilizing bar actually dips down, okay, toward the pedals, where the male stabilizing center bar is straight across. And of course, there's always this comment, it makes absolutely no sense based on anatomy, why the male stabilizing bar is straight across and the women's stabilizing bar dips. Well, the reason that the female stabilizing bar on a bike dips is to keep her skirt down. So there is the historical significance of the stabilizing bar on a woman's bike and why it dips. No one wanted to see her knickers. It would not have been ladylike. So, and then of course later on, bloomers do not become popular, but knickers do. So those are knee length. Bloomers were actually ankle length. So the bicycle riding outfit, which actually I find quite attractive. And while it wasn't necessarily a common article of dress to ride a bike, like I said, most women, they rode bikes in skirts. They actually rode motorbikes in skirts when motorbikes were first introduced right around the 1910s. So poor Amelia Bloomer, she didn't get very far regarding her new fashion of women, trying to introduce women to trousers. So
another question was, what impact did Ford and the auto and standard, those like assembly line type of processes have on the standardization of clothing? Is there any
process?
Yeah, just was there any correlation between that kind of industrial standardization in the clothing industry?
No, and I'll tell you why. And it is because making clothing, despite the fact clothing is now made in factories, it's very hands-on. And so most women are given a pile of garments, piecework, and they're to sit there and do it. And so it's a very hands-on thing. They're not just doing one thing and passing it on, doing one thing and passing it on. There's not a process and the only thing about dressmaking, or the garment industry that was mechanized at that point was actually the sewing machine regarding construction. So there wasn't a lot of mechanization. The sewing machine was the biggest part of that, where in the auto industry, everything is mechanized. Now, the garment industry has become quite sophisticated. Like, for example, there's a fantastic video by Levi Strauss and Company where there is a stack of denim fabric. I don't know, it's probably about 3 feet high, and they have a laser cutter go in and cut this massive stack into pant legs, that are ready to be sewn. And so that's incredible, an incredible advance in garment mechanization. But before this point, particularly, there really wasn't. It was a laborious task. And so the auto industry, it was far more sophisticated than the garment industry regarding mechanization. So
Kathleen notes that this was a huge transition. Was there pushback and criticism
for
just the change in garment styles, the different, changing to the sportswear and
there was. And of course, sportswear was driven by youth culture. But then again, most of our fashion is driven through youth culture. And we always criticize youth culture for their fashion choices, right? We do it today. And so it was criticized. Women were becoming emancipated through their clothing. And so, like I said, it was impractical for skirts to drag the ground. And so skirts were now up to mid-calf or just, a few inches above the ankle. That wasn't accepted years, the prior decade. That would have been considered not genteel, let's just put it that way. Not to mention women, the idea of wearing a corset and being confined and restricting movement. And so more and more women started wearing girdles, or they started wearing silk boxers and bandeaus. And so they were kind of, you know, they weren't held in like they used to. And that also spurred a little bit of criticism. But, you know, we moved on from it, as we always do when new and interesting forms of fashion are introduced into our culture. And to kind of give an example of how far we've come along, there is a story, and I cannot remember her name, maybe one of you out there might, but there is this fantastic story of this particular professional or socialite in the 1960s who was wearing a beautiful Chanel pantsuit, and she happened to walk into a restaurant. She was meeting someone in there to have dinner, and they would not admit her. They would not allow her in because she was wearing pants. Now, this is in the 1960s. And she was outraged because she didn't understand. She was dressed absolutely appropriately. She was wearing this beautiful designer suit. She was well known, extremely popular, and she was refused entrance. And it was simply because she was wearing a pantsuit. So she went into the bathroom, okay, with a friend, and asked the friend if she would take off her slip so she could wear it. And so the friend took off her slip. She handed it over to this particular woman. The woman took off her suit, she put on a slip, donned her heels, walked right back into the restaurant, and was granted entrance in her underwear. So fashion makes no sense sometimes, and how we receive fashion makes no sense. But today, women wear pants everywhere. Women wear pants. Women wear jammy pants to the store. You know, I mean, no one. So it's amazing. You know, the transition into one fashion mode into another is sometimes painful, but we get used to it. We do. We get used to it.
Great. Walt asks, do you see a reemergence of these skills, the dressmaker skills, with the interest in design shows that it's currently on?
No.
Okay.
No, I do not. And the reason, you know why? I'm just going to put it blank, because no one wants to pay for a dressmaker. No one wants to pay for her skill and the time it would take in labor. No one wants to pay. The beautiful thing about the United States is that we're all about the deal and consumerism. We kind of have this Walmart mentality regarding price and quality. And I am sure that there are artisans out there in the audience today who have had this experience where they have handmade something that takes a lot of skill to do and a lot of time, and they're at a particular venue where they are selling their crafts, and they will have someone come up to them and try to barter or bargain down the price on this particular item that not only can the customer who's bartering can't make, but also took the individual quite some time to construct. It's a real skill. And so the emergence of the American dressmaker, I don't foresee happening. We don't appreciate artisanship, and we don't want to pay for it. So.
Anne's wondering if you advise any college theater departments.
If I have advised any college theater departments, no. No.
Okay. Let's see. So a couple more comments here. It looks like people are sharing some information amongst themselves. That's great. Thank you very much for doing that. Let's see here if I've got any other specific questions. So Mary says thank you, and she wants to know when your book comes out.
Oh.
Great. Well, I'm not, see, I've got one other question it looks like. Let me go over here. So Judith is wondering if you can explain the origin of the house dress and piecework.
The origin
of the house dress and piecework.
Well, and piecework. Well, I'll start with piecework. Just to be clear, piecework, you're talking about piecework given to it's working in the home, basically. I think you might be referring to. Piecework in the garment, let's just be honest, the garment trade is an ugly trade. It really is. And it was not friendly to, and is not, let me repeat that, is not currently friendly to its employee base. And it certainly wasn't at the turn of the century as well. And so the United States, as we're getting this massive influx of immigrants, garment manufacturers, start employing particular immigrant populations, usually Italians and Jews, to do piecework. They did not want to hire them in because they were not considered white. So you can see the racist element here that goes along with this. So these people worked in their homes in terrible conditions. And of course they were paid by the piece to put certain things together. And these were worse than poverty wages. I mean, in a sense, they might as well have not even paid at all. I mean, it was just absolutely terrible, the conditions that they worked in and the wages that they were being paid. And of course, this was through greed. And spurred by racism. So the history of the house dress. Well, the ladies' house dress has been around for quite some time. It's been around actually since the Renaissance era, if I remember correctly. And the house dress is, I almost want to say the precursor to the pajama, but it's to modern day pajamas, or muumuu, or whatever women wear to relax in. But keep in mind that the house dress was warm and cozy, and women often received their intimate friends in their boudoirs while they were wearing their house coats. And but underneath that house coat, they were still strapped into a corset, wearing a chemise and drawers and everything else. So they weren't out of their most restrictive clothing. It's just their outer clothing was nice and loose. So.
Sorry, I was muted there. Does anybody have any additional questions? And while I wait, I'm going to announce upcoming fall series for the Far Hills Speaker Series in September, on September 20th. And these are all Sunday afternoons at 2 o'clock start times. And they will all be Zoom webinars, identical to this, just different topics. So the September 20th event will be presentation on the 75th anniversary of the atomic bomb. And Bob Bowman will be presenting on that historical event. In October, it's Sunday the 18th, and the topic is the Old Barn Club and the Golden Age of the Hills and Dales Park. And David Schmidt, who is a consulting member of the Oakwood Historical Society, will be presenting on that. In November, on the 15th, Tom Morrow, also a member of the Historical Society, will be presenting on how Oakwood grew from plat to plat. This covers about 70 years of history of how Oakwood developed into near to this city it is now. So if you're an Oakwood resident, it's a really good one to attend. So Mary did give us a question, and it's a reminder. I forgot to mention this earlier, but there are dresses at the library, and they're going to be here for one more week. So these are examples of dresses women may have worn during the historic period we were talking about, and Angela did make them. So if you want to see examples of that fashion from that era, we have those here at the library, and they'll be taken down Saturday. So come during the week, this week, and take a look at them. The library's open 10 to 1 and then 2 to 7 this week. So feel free to come in and check those out. They're absolutely fabulous. We've got some wonderful fabrics and just really neat dresses. Let's see. So Mary says she just saw Lucy Hayes, President Hayes from Fremont, and she says they're tiny. So she's wondering about, sure, the women of a century ago were larger than the double O dresses we always seem to see now. Did dress sizes change? I mean, I'm assuming, I don't know how that works.
Dress sizes have changed, and part of that has to do with that our nutrition has changed. And so as a people, Americans are taller and larger, of course, than we were 100 years ago. And like I said, that has a lot to do with nutritional value. But yeah, some of the dresses are dinky. I mean, they're just dinky, and it's hard to believe that a woman that tiny could even exist. But most women around the turn of the century were, you know, we kind of have this idea, this gone with the wind idea, that women had like 18-inch waists and things like that. And that's not necessarily true. Studies have been done in the garment industry, actually measuring clothing from this particular era, and the average woman had a 27-inch waist. Now, the average American woman today has a 35-inch waist, but the average woman then had a 27-inch waist, and that would equate, let me see, what would that be in retail size? About an 8, about a size 8, 6'8" in retail sizing. So, you know, in comparison, women were average size, or what we would consider you know, average, at least in 1980. The average size of women have gotten a little bigger. It's 14 now. So yeah, women were definitely smaller, but not as small as we think.
All right. Great. And again, there's a comment in the chat with a follow-up, so please feel free to use that. Just so everybody knows, you can save the chat from today if you want to save any of the information that is been put into the chat. So if you see the 3 dots down at the right where you enter the message, you click on that, and then there's a save chat option there if you want to save that. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. We have recorded this, and so I will be sharing the link to the recording with everyone here today, so you can share it with other people. And we'll also be sending it to make it available for anyone else to be able to watch it. Again, I want to thank Angela so much for doing this. It was wonderful, really informative.
Thank you.
And again, thank you to everyone who joined us. Hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.